Well, good evening, my friends, and welcome to another Bible study on the nines this Thursday evening, 9 o'clock. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight and studying the Bible together. I hope and trust this series has been a blessing and encouragement to you. I've really enjoyed going through book by book and looking at the key verse. We did the New Testament last year, doing the Old Testament now. We come to the book of Jeremiah tonight, and the key verse of an interesting book, and that of Jeremiah. This book is named after the prophet who wrote it, Jeremiah. Jeremiah, his name means Yahweh throws. God throws, in the sense of hurling the prophet into a hostile world or throwing down the nations in divine judgment for their sins. So Jeremiah was adequately named for the mission and the calling God had him for. Jeremiah was also a priest, according to chapter 1, verse 1. He was a gentle man, a sympathetic man, but he was called by God. He was called by God to proclaim a stern message of irreversible gloom. So first of all, tonight I want to give you some things about the man Jeremiah. Because of all the books of all the prophets in this section of the Old Testament, Jeremiah gives a lot about the man Jeremiah. He had a very interesting ministry at a very difficult time. He ministered during the last days of Judah, the southern kingdom of when it was divided Israel and Judah. He ministered during the last days, the last kings of the nation of Judah, up to their exile in Babylon, as 2 Kings describes it, 2 Chronicles describes it. His primary ministry was to the southern kingdom of Judah, primarily Jerusalem. He ministered at the same time as the prophet Zephaniah, the prophet Habakkuk, as well as Ezekiel and a little bit of Daniel, just a little bit of Daniel. He ministered for about 50 years. His ministry lasted from around 627 to 580 BC. His ministry spanned the reigns of the last kings of Israel, the last 5 kings of Israel. His ministry was to Josiah, the Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And also when King Nebuchadnezzar was ruling Babylon and conquered the nation of Judah. 3 stages of Jeremiah's ministry. From 627 to 605 BC, Jeremiah prophesied while Judah was being threatened by Assyria and Egypt. From 605 to 586 BC, we see Jeremiah proclaiming God's judgment while Judah was threatened and attacked 3 times from Babylon. From 586 to 580 BC, he ministered in Jerusalem and Egypt after Judah's downfall. Jeremiah was an eyewitness to some major world events around that time period of the last days of Judah. During his lifetime, Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon were all competing to see who was going to be the world power, world supremacy. Assyria was declining. Egypt had some power. Babylon's power was growing. Jeremiah accurately predicted that Babylon would rule the world and take all the Jews into captivity. In 612 BC, Babylon overthrew Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria, actually the reigning world power who had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. In 605 BC, Babylon defeated a coalition of the armies of Assyria and Egypt and became established as the leading power in the world. Nebuchadnezzar then attacked Judah and took Daniel and others hostage to Babylon and set up Jehoiakim as his vassal or puppet king in Jerusalem. 598 BC, Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon, according to 2 Kings 24. Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem again. He deported Jehoiachin, replaced him with Zedekiah. Zedekiah in 588 BC led another rebellion against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar attacked the 3rd time, and after an 18-month battle, destroyed the temple and city of Jerusalem in 586 BC, effectively deporting the rest there to Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar's army captured Jerusalem in 586 BC, Jeremiah, who had been imprisoned by Zedekiah, he was freed. And he was given the choice of staying in Jerusalem or going to Babylon in Jeremiah 39. But he chose to stay in the area of Jerusalem. But he was later abducted and taken to Egypt by Jews who fled there in hopes of escaping Nebuchadnezzar's wrath in Jeremiah 43. Jeremiah ministered a few years in Egypt, and probably, according to tradition, he died there in Egypt. He was a major witness to all that 2 Kings describes. Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet because of his melancholy tone. Next week, we're going to look at Lamentations and his laments, his weeping prophet status. But this book gives more insight into a personal life and the personal struggles of a prophet, more than any other in the Old Testament, and that is Jeremiah, because they all were men who had their problems, who had their struggles in their personal life. He, once again, I said he's known as the weeping prophet. It kind of describes his ministry. I mean, the last days of Judah being deported, Jeremiah was witnessing. Jeremiah was prophesying. Jeremiah's ministry was going on during this time. He rebuked the people severely for their idolatry, which sometimes involves sacrificing their children to foreign gods. He even, to their face, rebuked kings and was at the palace, had that opportunity. But the thing about it is, though he rebuked them and though he preached to them, he still loved the people in spite of their sins. He wept about them, he prayed for them, even when God had told him not to. In Jeremiah 7:16, Jeremiah 11:14, Jeremiah 14:11, because that was the will of God for them to be deported. But Jeremiah loved his people. And I thought about that when it comes to ministry. Us as pastors, us as ministers, we preach the gospel and we have to preach against sin. But on the flip side, severely we got to do that. We have to love people. And Jeremiah is a great model for that. Jeremiah was looked down upon by fellow priests and relatives because of his straightforward rebuke of their unfaithfulness to God and his condemnation of their worldly practices. I mean, we see in this book Jeremiah's heart, and we see his ministry. He faced constant opposition because of his faithful proclamation of God's message. Hey, he was instructed by God to use symbolism to highlight his message, because in that day, people would not listen to a prophet would preach the word, so he had to get their attention somehow. For example, in chapter 13 of Jeremiah, he buried the belt he was wearing until it was ruined and useless, illustrating that God's people would waste away in exile because of their sins. In chapter 16, verse 1 and 4, he was not allowed to marry or have children. He was single. He died single. It illustrates God's judgment on Judah would sweep away the next generation. Jeremiah was forbidden. He could not enter a funeral home or a place where a funeral was taking place. In that day, a house where a funeral was taking place, and a house where feasting was taking place. So were death and feasting two extremes. He could not enter either house, illustrating the thoroughness of the judgment that God would send. He also watched as a potter transformed a marred pot in the shape that he wanted in chapter 18, illustrating the sovereignty of God. He smashed a clay pot in chapter 19, illustrating the complete devastation God would bring on Judah. God showed Jeremiah two baskets of figs. One basket of good figs and the other basket of rotten figs in chapter 24, illustrating good and evil. The good people and the evil people there in the land of Judah. Because in the midst of all that stuff, there were still a remnant. He would put a yoke on his own neck in chapter 27, illustrating that Judah would have to submit to Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar threatened to conquer Judah, Jeremiah bought a field in his hometown of Anathoth in chapter 32, illustrating that God would bring his people back to the land after captivity as an investment. While Jeremiah was in Egypt, he placed some large stones at the entrance of Pharaoh's palace there in chapter 43, illustrating that Nebuchadnezzar would conquer Egypt. So some things he did as symbolism. Hey, Jeremiah named Babylon as the instrument of God's judgment more than the rest of the Bible put together. Jeremiah repeatedly urged Judah to submit to Babylon as God's instrument of discipline, recognizing that captivity was just a chastisement for their unfaithfulness, over and over their unfaithfulness to God. His fellow Jews and fellow citizens accused him of treason and being a traitor to their people. Hey, he wrote a letter in chapter 29 to the exiles in Babylon, urging him to expect a long captivity, to reject the lies of false prophets, and just to settle down and live a normal life. But the good part is he predicts God's wonderful promise of a new covenant that predicts what Jesus would do. He predicts a final restoration of Jews involving both Israel and Judah being regathered from the nations of the earth. According to tradition, Jeremiah was stoned to death while living in Egypt after Jerusalem was conquered by Babylon. Hebrews 11:37 does mention that some Old Testament saints were stoned. So that's a little bit about Jeremiah. When it comes to his prophecy, Jeremiah was given divine revelation concerning 4 prophetic points. One point was Jeremiah's own time. He prophesied in his own time, the final days, the last days of the nation of Judah, pointing out the sins of the people and emphasizing the inevitable consequences if they did not return to God. Another thing he did was the Babylonian captivity and their return from Babylon, because he announced it would last 70 years in Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29:10. He emphasized the first coming of Christ, the new covenant, a covenant that God will establish through Jesus Christ in Jeremiah 31 through 34. And that kind of continued that covenant that God made through Noah and Abraham and Moses and David. He also predicted the Messianic kingdom on earth. And in the middle of a book filled with prophecies of condemnation and negativity, if you would, Jeremiah declares a message of hope centered around the Messiah reigning on earth. So we move from the man's life and move to the book, the actual book of Jeremiah. Let's consider some things. The theme of the book of Jeremiah is to portray God as patient and holy. Hey, the purpose of Jeremiah, to list the moral and spiritual causes of the coming catastrophes upon Judah, but also to proclaim God's gracious promise of hope and restoration. Hey, the key word is Judah's last hour. If you look at the book and divide it into sections, you see the first section is chapter 1, the call of Jeremiah. God calls Jeremiah and sets him apart to be his prophet before he was born. Chapter 2, the chapter 45, you see prophecies to Judah, where he prophesies to the people of Judah in the days before the Babylonian captivity. He prophesies to the remnant of Jews who remained in the land after Judah fell. He prophesies to the Jews who fled to Egypt to avoid being taken captive. And he even prophesies in chapter 45 to his secretary Baruch. A third section is the prophecies to the Gentiles from chapter 46 to 51. 9 Gentile nations: Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Syria, Arabia, Elam, and Babylon. Then the fall of Jerusalem, the fourth section, chapter 52. A very graphic description that echoes the last chapter of 2 Kings of how Jerusalem was captured, destroyed, and plundered. The leaders were killed and the captives were taken to Babylon. But if there's a key verse in this book of the Bible, we find it here in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 23 and 24. Let me read this to you. But this is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people. And walk in all the ways that I've commanded you, that it may be well with you. Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but followed the counsels and dictates of their evil hearts, and went backward and not forward. Good thought there. Are we going backward in our Christian life, or are we going forward? We see in this key verse, there was a reminder of God's covenant, where he says, I will be your God, and you shall be my people. That harkens back to Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, and all that God did for Israel, and a covenant that he made with them. And there's the responsibility of God's command. Obey my voice, walk in my ways. But, you see that in the verse, they did not obey, they did not incline their ear, they did not listen, and they followed their own counsel and they followed their own heart, and the result was they went backward and not forward. Anytime, folks, we go our own way and we fail to obey God and walk in his ways as believers, we will go backward and not forward. Another way of talking about this is backsliding. The goal in a Christian life is forward progression, not backward regression. This verse unlocks the book, because the reason why this nation was in their last days and why there was a literal bondage, they were already in bondage spiritually because of the deception of sin and the temptations of the idolatry around them, and the fact they would not hear God when he spoke to them. This book of the Bible gives insight on the struggles of ministry and how you can encourage yourself in the Lord, seeing things bigger picture. This book also teaches us the consequences of continual sin and stubbornness when we're corrected. This book also points to Christ and the new covenant as we have in him as a result of his sacrifice at Calvary's cross. You can parallel this man's struggles and his ministry to the struggles we see in our country today. It seems on a spiritual level that our nation is going backward and not forward. It seems we are decaying from the inside out. Any preaching or Bible correction is met with criticism and cynicism and stubbornness. We need revival, my friend. We need a movement of the Spirit of God upon our churches and our people. It's a tough time to be a minister of the gospel. It's a tough time to be a Christian, but oh, what an opportunity to be a light, to shine as lights in a dark world, just as Jeremiah did in his day. There's so much pressure, and we can get as melancholy as Jeremiah did in his time. But we are to obey God regardless of the cost and walk in his ways and apply his word so that we are shining as lights in this dark, dark world in these last days. What a thought there and what a challenge. I hope this gave you a little insight on Jeremiah. I hope it whet your appetite to read this book of the Bible. Hey, thanks for tuning in and listening tonight. I hope and trust you have a great evening and a great weekend. Looking forward to seeing you here at Bethlehem Baptist Church Sunday morning if you're in the area, 9:30 Sunday school, 10:30 worship. We are looking at a series, Servant-Hearted, Kingdom-Minded, Christ-Focused. We looked at Servant-Hearted last week. Sunday morning, we're going to talk about being kingdom-minded. Hope to see you then. Hope you can join us. And I hope you have a good evening. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in, and God bless you.